So what I'm going to do today is describe a project of mine that's presently at its final stages of development for consideration by a UK funding agency. It's scheduled to run for 5 years, and its major outcome will be full and freely available transcriptions of the variant manuscripts of Alfred's Catholic homilies. I'm to be principal investigator on the project, and the co-investigators will be my colleague in Glasgow, Mark Alexander, very cheerful, and Chris Lintott in Oxford. The project consultants will be Ben Albritton, who is excitingly live in this very room, and also Elaine Trahan, both from Stanford. Who could deny money to those faces? First, yeah. Full stop. First, some background. Alfred, of course, casts a long shadow over the pre-conquest period in England. Jonathan Wilcox estimates that his works alone make up almost 15% of all surviving Old English, a corpus that as a whole runs to just under 14 million words. 600,000 of these are by Alfred. This corresponds to about 2/3 of Shakespeare's output, or about 3/4 of Jane Austen's, or all of the Old Testament, or the statistic my students seem to prefer, just over half the Harry Potter series. Today, Alfred is probably best known for his monumental 2 series of Catholic homilies, each comprising 40 items, produced between 991 and 992. While Alfred's output is undoubtedly impressive, it pales into insignificance, rather compared with his reach, or in Research Council terms, impact. Alfred's material continued to be copied for almost 200 years after his death, and his work was read, commented on, and as we've seen, glossed in manuscript form well into the 14th century. That's not even starting to consider his afterlife in the Reformation. Not just that, but the geographical spread of Alfred's manuscripts is impressively wide. Copies of the Lives of the Saints and the Catholic homilies, his major works, can be traced to Canterbury, Durham, Exeter, Rochester, Winchester, Worcester, and Bury St Edmunds. And those, of course, are just the ones that can be assigned to specific centres. But as a whole, over 50 manuscripts or manuscript fragments survive of one or more of the Catholic homilies, the latest of which manuscript is this one, probably early 13th century. Many of the homilies appear in very large collections containing substantial selections of Alfred's work alongside anonymous texts. The most frequently copied of the homilies appears in no fewer than 18 manuscripts. In short, there's a lot of Alfred out there. This geographical and chronological spread of his work is the principal reason why these texts are of value to people like me, the linguist, particularly as evidence of the shift from Old to Middle English, where little material survives from this key transitional period. Not just that, but these texts aren't simply passively copied, but actively engaged with. But the full range of this activity isn't reflected in the standard editions of the Catholic homilies, that of the first series by Peter Clemos and of the second by Malcolm Godden. They note only substantive variants in the apparatus, those that help to establish the textual tradition of the homilies. This observation isn't intended in any sense as a criticism of these magnificent scholars. Their interests, after all, were properly focused on Alfred himself and the identification of the discrete stages of the development of the homilies. I merely point out that it's hard to retrieve detailed linguistic information from them. Now, substantive variants are, of course, included by Godden and Clemos, and those substantive variants, of course, include lexis. And you may feel that there's little to gain, then, from this initiative from that point of view. You would be wrong. Let's look at a single example from Alfred's first series, Homily on Pentecost, edited by Peter Clemos. So, in order to keep the apparatus down to manageable proportions, Clemos removes a number of the substantive variants from later manuscripts to an appendix, those which, in his view, seem to reflect only the late date of the manuscripts. They include the manuscript we've just seen, datable, as I said, probably to the beginning of the 13th century. And when you take a look at the edition, here's the first page of a list of variants supplied for the manuscript, covering around about a fifth of the homily. It's not the whole story, though. For a start, this manuscript includes a range of additions amounting in some cases to whole sentences. These don't appear in the appendix, but rather are recorded in the main apparatus as evidence for the text's transmission. This bifurcated method of reporting makes it hard to appreciate the full nature of the changes made to the text in this manuscript, whether lexical, syntactic, or, for want of a better term, structural. And indeed, what's often interested is what's not updated as well as what is. So here, in this list of variants, we can see the Old Norse loanword lagu, replacing Alfred's native term law, something we would expect perhaps by this date. And here's the first example of this in the manuscript. Straightforward, you might imagine, except that, in fact, on all 7 other occasions that the concept appears in the whole same homily, the noun used by Alfred is, in fact, retained. So here's a little rash of them. Now, you would need to be on absolutely top form and be on pretty thorough acquaintance with the homily to infer this from the silence of the variants in an appendix. In this case, the retention of along lagu is important because these occurrences in this manuscript constitute that native term's last recorded outing. What's perhaps equally worth mentioning is what happens in the same homily from in another late manuscript, Bodley 343, of the second half of the 12th century. Once again, the first 2 occurrences of the noun are replaced with lagu. There's the first example. But then, again, later on, several are retained, with only 2 thoroughgoing, red-blooded replacements in the parallel passage I noted before, and one kind of vacillating one, where he copies the Old English term, thinks better of it, and then writes the Old Norse loanword to its left. I find this interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it. I note it here only to underline what is perhaps an obvious point, that a list of variants is not the whole story, and certainly to a casual observer could be misleading. That's lexis. Of course, spelling and phonological variants fare rather less well in the editions, as they are not provided at all in the apparatus or appendices, and there's a great deal of potentially interesting information here. Again, it is no use just casually flicking through a manuscript and pulling out something strange and making a deal out of it. You need a lot of tokens of a particular form if the conclusions you reach are going to be valid. I've engaged with this material myself as part of the Mellon-funded project that you mentioned in the introduction, looking at the language of 4 related manuscripts. These 4, each of which contain copies of the same sequence of Alfrician and anonymous pieces. This, as you've heard, is set to appear in Digital Philology later in the year. For me, the process highlighted 2 things. First, it's vital to see Alfric, whether from a perspective linguistic or literary or theological, within the manuscript context in which he appears. In other words, alongside the anonymous or composite texts that so frequently are found intermingled with his work. The second thing I learned, quite literally to my cost, is how extraordinarily profligate of time and money it is to transcribe manuscript material using research assistants or graduate students. There's a real issue here then with my grandiose aim of getting all the variant manuscript copies of Alfred's Catholic homilies transcribed in full, particularly given what I've just said about the importance of considering them in context and within the context of the company they keep. I mentioned over 50 manuscripts containing Alfrician homilies. Most of these contain anonymous material as well, and our intention is to transcribe these manuscripts in full. If 50 manuscripts seems a lot, 11,000 manuscript pages, which is what this broadly amounts to, seems a task positively Herculean. I can transcribe as fast as I can type, and I can type quite fast, but a calculation suggests that I shall need a certain amount of help unless I'm blessed with longevities to rival Methuselah's. Happily, We think that much of this work is potentially achievable with the help of the public, and our project proposes that we crowdsource this work. We're blessed here with our manuscripts. Anglo-Saxon and early medieval English book script, being generally non-cursive, is comparatively easy to read, even by non-specialists. Letter recognition is fairly straightforward. There aren't that many discrete abbreviations, and errors are readily identifiable. So that's the plan. How then is it going to be done, and what are the challenges and potential pitfalls? We're first pretty lucky in that the vast majority of the manuscripts, in fact all but about 5% of them, are housed for us in one of 3 repositories: the Parker Library of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, the British Library and the Bodleian Library. The manuscripts at Corpus and some others have already been digitised. The rest will be done specially for the project. In order to get these manuscripts ready for the onslaught of the crowd, we'll be preparing them in various ways. The first is to create an updated and modernised list of contents for each of the manuscripts, where the start and end of each text and of scribal stint is reported by not just folio, but also line number. Again, we're lucky here in having reliable sources, such as Carr's catalogue, to take as a starting point. We'll then divide the page images of each of the manuscripts into separate lines and present them individually to the volunteer. I got this idea from the Mellon project, whose remit included trialling and refinement of generic tools for digital scholarship. The deal was to use the web-based tool TPen as part of my research, and this is where I started to realise its potential for this related project. TPen, as I'm sure many of you here will know, stands for the Transcription for Paleographical and Editorial Notation, and it's an open web-based tool for working with images of manuscripts. It's got quite a number of features, as you can see from this promo poster, but I want to focus on its transcription tool. Say you want to transcribe this page. You simply navigate to the folio you're interested in, having uploaded it to the TPen site, where you'll find that one of the options for viewing is to return the page with the lines identified, ready for keying in this transcription. So it does it, in other words, it parses these lines automatically. The TPen developers claim a success rate of 80% for its parser. I think that's somewhat flattering, but it is quite easy and surprisingly restful to adjust the lines manually. Once you've done that, you can start transcribing line by line, and the transcription box floats down the page as you go, presenting you with each line in turn. As you can imagine, this is handy for a beginning student because it keeps the attention focused on a single line. In terms of the Mellon project, it turned out to be of limited value, as it's in fact quicker and easier for experienced transcribers simply to keep typing. But nevertheless, it got me thinking about other ways in which this kind of technology could be used. The problem with a lot of text transcription crowdsourcing ventures is that they can be over-facing. My feeling about it is that the public need to enjoy themselves in order to do the work at all. Being faced with folio 1 recto of a manuscript and being told to get on with it for a couple of hundred folios is likely to put off all but the most dedicated or lonely. TPen's ability to fill it out a line is specifically what we're interested in here, and it's this technology or something similar that will be adapted to present individual lines to the transcriber, along with a sample alphabet, including suspension and punctuation marks, which comes from the work of the scribe responsible for that specific tranche. Each manuscript will at that point be filtered to remove Latin rubrics and particularly challenging lines from the transcription queue. Now, there are obvious advantages to the approach I'm describing, and less obvious ones too, such as copyright. The volunteer will only be seeing one line at a time in high resolution, along with a thumbnail of the rest of the page for context. Having transcribed a line, a volunteer will be asked if he or she would like more of the same, in which case another line from the same scribal hand will appear, or whether they would prefer to try the hand at something different. What will the interface look like? Well, we intend something similar to this, the Ancient Lives Papyrus project at Oxford, where volunteers are being asked to transcribe the Greek of thousands and thousands of papyrus fragments. Here, you can see that there's a keyboard, And as you click on a particular letter, up pops a sample graph. That's what we're going to be refining. The crowdsourcing tool will be developed by the same enormously experienced Zooniverse team, fronted by Chris Lintott, of the Sky at Night fame, for those of you astronomers of you out there. We plan to improve this interface by, as I've just mentioned, using tailored alphabets drawn from the output of individual scribes, rather than just a generic one. And we think that that is an important adaptation to make. And this kind of point-and-click interface with pop-up letters as used here will make it easier for the user to distinguish graphs, which are actually quite distinct, but which beginners routinely find difficult in Anglo-Saxon script varieties, such as S and R. For those of you who are sceptical of the public's interest in or ability to transcribe Old English, it's worth bearing in mind that there are over 500,000 registered users on the Ancient Lives site, who have beavered away on a job which is considerably more challenging. We've no doubt that our project will prove a similarly big hit. In fact, the first thing that the Zooniverse developers said to us was that 11,000 manuscript pages weren't very many for this kind of project. So the concern that we'll end the project short of our target has to some degree been allayed, but concerns of course remain, of which the most important is how we're going to ensure accuracy. Well, there are various solutions, of course, to that, and we're planning to use two in combination. The first is the multiple response approach. The same line is served to a number of different people. Only when several agree on the same transcription, perhaps 3 or 4 or 5, will that line be taken out of the transcription queue. We also plan to test individual worker reliability by occasionally seeding lines that a member of the project team has already transcribed and weighting the value of an individual's responses. What else? Well, we'll have a variety of ways in which we're going to ask the public to identify interventions on a page. That brings us, of course, to the tremulator and also, of course, the tremulous Worcester hand. Alfrich loved the tremulous Worcester hand almost as much as I love Alfrich. Rather the other way. Hang on, wait a minute, let me get that right. Must get my chronology right. The tremulous Worcester hand loved Alfrich almost as much as I do. We need to get the public to identify interventions. We cannot, as you've seen from the nature of the tremulous scribe himself, we cannot expect the public to be able to transcribe this material, but we have plans for this. We also have a suite of training pages, clickable, honourable information about Alfrich, and the normal accoutrements of a modern life, including blog, Twitter feed, and a looming media presence. Once the transcriptions are done, the individual lines will be sewn back together, and the word separation will be adjusted as far as possible automatically using natural language processing algorithms. This task falls to my co-I, Mark Alexander. The unnormalised files will also be available to anyone who is interested in this information. The transcriptions can then be downloaded from the project website free of charge and will offer a range of options and search criteria which can be used separately or in combination. Like, for example, a user might want to look at or download the output of a specific scribe, or all the manuscript copies of a particular text, or the entire transcribed contents of a manuscript. Flexibility is key here. This project, of course, is easily extendable. I chose manuscripts of Alfrich's Catholic homilies because there are lots of them and they were copied over a period of a couple of centuries. But there are other obvious candidates as well, like perhaps the products of the Alfredian translation programme. Even later medieval manuscripts might be a possibility, though of course they represent a much greater challenge in terms of transcription. In whatever way this enterprise is taken on in the future, I think we'll benefit from the experience gained from this one, particularly as we will be pioneers as we work through the realities of manuscript production and the problems they raise, such as how best to signal the wealth of interventions, insertions, deletions, glosses, and so on in a typical page like this. No doubt there'll be refinement of our preliminary strategies for dealing with these features, but I feel we're ready to rise to the challenge and to press the power of the inexhaustible public into service. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A fascinating project, because I'm at the UCL Centre for Strategic Humanity Crowdsourcing, and I'm sure you know something we're very, very much involved in, the Bentham project. And a spin-off from that is the Transcriptorium project, because we've used the Bentham, the transcriptions of the Bentham papers for machine learning to allow it to actually parse and to transcribe automatically. The success rate is about 80% at the moment, so it's getting there.
Yeah, no,
but
it is getting there.
Using a source that you have transcribed with the original, and you can do exactly the same thing. You use that as a learning tool for an automatic process. I did have some questions, but you answered them all as I went through.
Oh my gosh.
So, anyone from the floor?
David's got one.
Yes, please.
That was fantastic, very exciting, and of course I have to ask, what are the plans for dealing with the intervention?
Yeah, no, so we obviously know the manuscripts that the Tremulous Worcester scribe worked on. Let's stick to Tremulous hand for this time being. And we know the kinds of things that he did, like, for example, update the particle year with Y. So what we can do is we can alert the user. So they transcribe the line, and then we say, we know that this manuscript has got glosses. We know that they're of this type. So can you look for little marks? Because sometimes they're very discreet, aren't they? Those, for example, the I for the GE. Do you notice it? Can you point to it? Because it is going to, yes, you can see it there. There's going to be a point and click type thing. With the longer glosses, what we're going to ask them to do is to note the start and the end of them so that they're positioned on the page. So that all you will know from this is that there is something there, there is a gloss there. In terms of additions and deletions, we think that's a bit easier. We can say what type of intervention it is. And actually what I really liked about the paper you gave was the Tremulator app with a degree of certainty. I think that's a really, really strong idea. And so we can say, you know, are you sure that this is there, or are you not sure that this is there? I should say that we're planning for this to be an add-on, because some people might just like transcribing Old English and then get concerned about having to do something else. Others might like the challenge. So we're going to say, thanks for the line, do you notice anything funny about it? Yes, no. And if the answer is yes, do you want to have a go at trying to explain what's going on here? But we need to automate it as much as possible so that we're not getting a whole range of responses which are quite hard to weigh up, because people will explain things obviously in different ways. They might point to the same thing.
It also has the potential of slowing things down. I mean, if your average user has gotten to the point where they can transcribe the Old English fairly well, and then they run into something like the shaky gloss right there.
I think that's fine. I mean, I think you say, you know, do you notice? We know that the Tremulous hand is at work on this. Do you notice any glosses on this line? And all they need to do is say yes or no.
Yes, right,
and then
actually transcribe.
If they want, no, they certainly won't. We would never ask them to transcribe the glosses, but we will ask them if they want to point to the start and the end, and then at least people working back through the manuscript will know that there's something there. We thought about not doing it at all, but it just seems a waste, because we're going to be looking at every page of this. So they might as well, if they're interested in it, and I think people will be quite interested in it. And there'll be something about, for more on this chap, press here and then you can read a bit about him.
Cool. Yes, I think it's very good to flag up anything that's particularly interesting in the manuscript.
That's right.
Necessarily asking.
Yeah, asking them. We are as I say, we would certainly never ask them to transcribe any of the glosses. Yeah, that's right.
We have the control for a Bentham expert who does the quality control, and we're very, very fortunate.
How do you instruct your workforce? Are you going to give them a list of instructions? Are you going to have an interface? Or?
It's going to be an interface. From what I've learnt about crowdsourcing, you can't do what we would like them to do, which is a small 2-year course on the elements of paleography. So they've got to be able to do it right from the start. So there will be training pages if they would like to do them, but they have to have the chance of skipping those training pages if they just want to go straight ahead. So in terms of this, that's why I quite like the point. You point to each individual letter, and then you get the scribal tranche. So you will see that scribe's D, and that I think was going to give you a better chance of being able to identify the D from any other letter, and then you move on that way. We are thinking, for those who get interested in this and get good at it, we are thinking of having an alternative way of entering transcription, which doesn't rely so much on that. The reason why we want to do point and click is because of word separation issues. We obviously can't expect them to start trying to, and we don't particularly want them to start segregating out individual words. We're also going to try to link it a little bit to language, because we know that people are very interested in language and language change. So we can say, you know, in this homily you will notice that there are these words, and then give them modern English reflexes.
Okay, we need to move on now, but just thank Katie once more. And I'm